this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
Today on the Life Science Succes podcast, I'm interviewing Christopher Pirie. He's co-founder and CEO of HDT Bio. His technical experience is centered primarily on protein enzyme engineering with forays into synthetic biology, metabolic engineering, polymers, drug delivery, biopharmaceuticals. In entrepreneurship, Christopher is motivated by alternative financing business models for commercialization of cutting-edge technologies, creative strategies for protection of intellectual property, and laser-focused on customer engagement and end-user value creation. Welcome, Christopher.
Thanks a lot, Don. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so can you tell the listeners just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm originally a California boy. I live up here in Seattle now, ever-growing city that we have, actually quite a biotech scene as well. And when I'm not trying to start new biotech companies, I'll play a little soccer or do some sailing as well.
All right. Very good. Yeah. So in Seattle, you're getting rained on all the time, I'm sure.
Yeah, right up until we hit the heat dome like we did a couple of weeks ago.
It's one of the well-known secrets I know for anybody that's in Seattle is just the wonderful weather that honestly is out there. I'm sure you get your share of rain, but at the same time, I think it's well overplayed that it's always gloomy and rainy in Seattle. But
we'll keep telling the rest of the friends around the country that it's all great here.
Beautiful spot in the country overall. Yeah. So in terms of your history, I found it interesting that you also went to school at MIT. Is that correct?
Yeah, indeed. I went out to MIT in 2006 to pursue my PhD and overall did my 10-year East Coast stint before coming back to the West Coast.
Okay. Yeah. Once you got out towards Boston, you didn't want to just stay there forever?
So between Boston and San Francisco, you have two of arguably the largest biotech hubs in the world. So certainly as I started my career there was a gravity that attempted to keep me there. But between having my family out here on the West Coast and having to deal with those Boston winters, that was all the motivation I needed.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And then I guess what helped you transition then from the technical areas and the biopharmaceutical areas over to wanting to be an entrepreneur?
So as I was pursuing my PhD at MIT, I think maybe one of the first things was realizing that I wasn't in the upper echelon of bench scientists amongst my peers there. And when I was growing up, my dad had been something of an entrepreneur in the telecom space and around the dot-com boom. And being in high school and going to a small office and seeing young people running around and the energy of that space gave me the inclination that would be something fun to do. And when you combine that with being around MIT and all the inventiveness there alongside the Sloan School, which is a tremendous center for entrepreneurship, teaching generally. And so while I was working towards my PhD, I was also taking classes at the Sloan School and networking and writing about entrepreneurship and just being a part of that ecosystem as actively as I could be. And it was really somewhat fortuitously, as these things often happen at MIT, that I met a couple of my co-founders for my first company there.
Okay. Right now, you're the founder of HDT Bio. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it is that you're doing at HDT? What is
Interestingly, the focus of HDT was originally oncology and continues to be an important area of research. But so many in our field, as the COVID pandemic sort of ran rampant last year, we found ourselves attempting to apply our technologies towards the pandemic situation. In light of that, we've now advanced a vaccine candidate and is now our leading product in the clinic, the most advanced demonstration of one of the core technologies at HDT. And I think the overarching theme technologically for our company is really RNA therapeutics and RNA vaccines. This being a really exciting new modality that has had a chance to shine during the pandemic with the vaccines now in use.
Yeah, and I guess can you tell us anything about the clinical trial that you're advancing? Where will it be located? Where are you in that journey?
Given the business model that we're pursuing and the tremendous network of collaborators we have around the world, we have an opportunity to advance trials in a lot of different places, but the most advanced of which is by way of our collaborator, Genova Biopharmaceuticals in India. They have now completed phase 1 clinical trial and will be entering a phase 2/3 clinical trial in short order. As many companies at our stage have observed, there's a growing response worldwide to the pandemic, but a remaining need really outside of the US and Europe that is definitely unaddressed. And Genova and HDT have been collaborating for over a year now. We've also been working with the NIH and federal agencies in India to help advance this program. And so it's been a tremendously collaborative effort to bring it to this point. Also recently announced the allowance or notice to proceed from the FDA on our US clinical trial. And then we'll also be initiating clinical trials in other territories with partners that are yet to be publicly announced that we'll hope to be announcing soon.
And then, so you said that you're working on both the COVID side of the business as well as the oncology side of the business. How is that balancing those two worlds, given you're a fairly early startup as well? How's that been?
Yeah, it's non-trivial for sure. As you point out, we are a 20-person or so company now, growing quickly though we may be. And having multiple programs, either in the clinic or on the cusp of being in the clinic, is quite the management effort and scientific endeavor, no less. I think COVID had the effect of giving us an opportunity to accelerate the demonstration of the safety and very soon we hope the efficacy of our vaccine platform, and probably had a subtle effect on delaying the developmental progression of some of our other oncology programs. But we're now as people are coming back to work more and more, and we're seeing these programs move their way now and make the progress we hope to see in the near future towards the clinic as well. And these include not only the combination of RNA with our formulation technologies for vaccine, and certainly as you might hear or read about some of the other RNA vaccine companies, there are opportunities in oncology for vaccination against different cancers. But we also have a class of what are called innate immune stimulants, which are another interesting immuno-oncology RNA molecule that, when combined with our formulation technologies, have a lot of promise as well. Suffice it to say, we have a pretty broad portfolio that we think can have an impact on a lot of different malignancies. And we're trying as best we can, indeed through partnership in many cases, to accelerate these towards the clinic.
Yeah. And so earlier on, you talked a little bit about your journey as an entrepreneur as well. And I oftentimes ask entrepreneurs this just because I find it interesting, one, how people from one thing to the next. Early on in your sort of entrepreneurial career, what do you think that you carried forward now to HDT Bio? And what are some of the things that you might have learned early and you've left them behind?
Yeah, I think coming out of MIT, I was, like many scientists at that stage, probably well-trained technically, but undertrained operationally. It's not a core part of the academic scientist training module to learn about management of people, really. And it was, for me, in my first venture, and with great gratitude to my co-founders there, I learned a lot about managing people. And it's those people skills, I think, that have helped me navigate my way through my subsequent 2 ventures. And all along the way, trying to pick up as much as I can about how do you build businesses that are sustainable. For me, that's something that the biotech industry and perhaps other industries as well have lost their way a little bit. For me, too often I see it in entrepreneurship, the goal is to raise money or achieve the exit liquidity event for your investors. And that's all well and good. People got to make money. But we, throughout my various experiences, there's always been a focus shared by our co-founders that the end game is not to make money necessarily, but to have an impact on the world. And whether that's in synthetic biology by way of renewable chemicals or in biopharmaceuticals, saving lives, as is the grand challenge here, to me, that's one of the greatest takeaways I think I've had from my experiences, is the importance of a focus on the impact rather than cash flow necessarily.
Sure. Yeah, it's probably a major challenge for most early entrepreneurs, especially just to give credit where credit's due as well. When I look at what you're having to do with any form of drug discovery, unlike other forms of, healthcare businesses, there's really no way to monetize your business until you get to end stage trials and a product that you can actually start to commercialize. And with all of that said, early on, very much your focus should be on both areas, right? One, raising capital, but also just explaining that the end impact is really the goal. And if you achieve the goal of, better treatment for cancer patients or even ways to prevent COVID, then the monetization may happen, right? Otherwise, unless we stay focused on kind of the broader spectrum of the bigger goal, hey, look, we're in this to really save cancer patients and or prevent COVID in your case, then you may not get to that end goal, right?
Yeah, indeed. There are enough mechanisms these days, especially given the crazy liquidity in the markets right now, for people to turn dollars hand over fist. Good for them. We in previous companies and in HDT, we, at early stages in particular, focus a lot on grant revenue. So funding early stage research and discovery through federal or international awards. And then when it comes time to develop these products and move them into the clinic, partnerships internationally are so important because there are markets all over the world that have a tendency to be ignored here and there, especially if we look at the idea that the US healthcare market represents half of the global market. It's easy to see why investors and companies alike will tend to focus heavily here.
Sure.
But that does not preclude the idea that through value sharing partnerships, one can generate early stage revenue in a way that helps you address the domestic market and capture that value down the road. And I think that's very consistent with the way we're behaving at HDT right now.
Yeah, it is interesting because I've seen firsthand the true value of partnerships, both inside of the US and as well as outside. I've seen very strong how European partnerships as well are just fabulous for some companies. They're just in terms of feeding the early growth. Eventually, things like venture capital and things like that become important, but also early on, balancing that approach is important as well. And I think I guess the other added point that I would make as well is that as a company, continues to grow, it seems to me like there are real true opportunities to consider the broader global impact of what it is that you're doing. One of the things I've learned from the podcast and interviewing a lot of people is in one of the interviews, we talked about Latin America and just the fact that the drugs that we're talking about today probably won't be available for 10 years plus in some portions of Latin America. And it's just shocking to me to hear that vast disparity. Whenever I think of the world, I think of the fact that most of the world will have access to the same things at the same time. That seems to not be the case. And so maybe that's the reason for some of these international partnerships as well and the overall value there.
Indeed. Yeah. Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, these are places where access is constrained fundamentally, but also there are infrastructural challenges. And so one of the things we do with partners, and we partner with folks at, varying stages of developmental maturity. So certainly in Genova, in India, we have a partner who is well experienced in bringing pharmaceutical products to market and engaging with regulatory agencies and running clinical trials. But in other parts of the world, we've engaged with companies who are, say, more focused on manufacturing so that we can bring some of the clinical development expertise or technological expertise and then expand our manufacturing operations to increase accessibility that way. So I think there are a lot of different modes by which to try and drive expanded access, and that can also be value creating for an early stage venture like ours.
Yeah, and as you expand partnerships outside of the US, I guess the other question I would have as well is, so there probably is a benefit in terms of populations outside of the US and the requirements. I know for some other countries, oftentimes there are requirements that where you take a look at specific populations of people that are more central to those areas of the country that you do want your drug or even your diagnostic to be approved. So is that part of the benefit as well?
Sure. The more data we can gather globally, the more instructive it can be for the safety and eventual efficacy of our vaccines and therapeutics. And indeed, it is in the acute interest of our territorial partners to ensure that when they're advancing our technologies or our candidates, that they are showing that same safety and efficacy in their population. And that is aligned with the interest of their regulatory bodies as well. So whether we run a full set of registration trials in every single territory that we partner, well, that's really just a question for those agencies. But certainly driving access can only lead to more data, which can only lead to more informed decisions.
Okay. And in terms of the biggest challenges that HDT faces today, what are some of the biggest challenges that you're facing right now?
You already touched upon one of them, which is scaling and advancing the diverse technologies and candidates we have. At 20 people and growing the rate we are, hiring is a non-trivial effort, but also a sink on the time of the existing team. And this is common to all early stage ventures, biotech or not, is finding good people. And we're lucky enough to be here in Seattle, surrounded by some pretty astonishing research institutions between the Fred Hutch and the University of Washington Institute for Systems Biology. So there are some really profoundly inventive scientists that we're able to draw upon here. And then the success of the ecosystem in other biotech commercialization entities as well gives us a bit of a pool to draw upon. But that certainly has been one of the biggest hurdles. And then I would say manufacturing as well. So you've seen it a bit already in some of the RNA vaccines that have come to market and the challenges that they've faced in either supply chain and delivery. But this is a new modality, unlike, say, protein therapeutics, which have been around for 20 or 30 years or more, and it has a very robust sort of contract research backbone for supporting development from early stage companies. That too, I think, is a bit of a challenge for us as yet.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because my consulting business is solely focused on helping organizations like yours scale 20 people plus, so helping people through those barriers. And it's interesting because you touched on all of the key things that we focus on as a company. And how do we help companies accelerate through those barriers and really hit home in terms of getting to the finish line faster is really what a lot of the companies that I work with want to do. And so it sounds to me like you've got all of the overall focus in the right areas in terms of, leadership and things like that. And some of the startups that I've helped as well, I've seen these massive pools of people where you're trying to bring people in. And I oftentimes explain that there's a density of people that you get to where eventually you look back and you say, you know what, we've added 50% more people, but it doesn't seem like we're getting 50% more work done. Oftentimes those are the struggles that you have, but it goes back to that. What are your leadership? What's your leadership? What are the standards that you're working on? And those sort of things are the basis of where at least I start with oftentimes with companies.
Yeah, it's an astute observation and we're living it right now. I have to explain to every hiring manager that yes, your productivity is going to go down first before it goes back up, because you're going to expend energy and time investing in the recruiting process and finding the right candidates and interviewing them and onboarding them and training them. And then if you're lucky, you'll get to the back end of that and they'll start adding value to your team and generating more productivity than you had before. But yeah, it's an investment for sure to grow in the ways that we are right now.
And getting that flywheel turning is important. That's the main thing with most of the startups overall, is just how do we get things moving so that we can accelerate through this and really get there as quickly as possible. So yeah. So there are 3 questions that I like to ask every guest. What inspires you?
Talking about the pandemic, one of the things that's inspired me in such a challenging time is to see our industry spark a certain level of collaboration that I think had stagnated a little bit coming into the pandemic. It is central to the way HDT behaves, but because of the traditional venture models and the need to retain value, the collaborative modes, be it between pharmaceutical developers or between developers and manufacturers, I think you've seen examples in the last year and a half of people forming alliances and coming together to collaborate between academia and industry, between industry and manufacturing in ways that we might not have otherwise seen. And that's really inspiring to me, that certainly when challenged, our industry can respond in that way. And it gives me hope for the future in as much as that, like, perhaps it will continue this way as we handle the pandemic and move on to other indications as well.
Yeah, it has been extremely inspiring. And the one thing that you're seeing the end result of now is, I really would hope that it creates a greater acceleration in our ability to approve things, and not just have them as emergency use authorizations in the US with the FDA, but also getting them through these cycles faster. Overall, I know that the safety controls are in place for a reason. As somebody that has family members that have been affected by COVID, I certainly would like to see things come to light faster, not just for COVID, but for everything in the future.
Yeah, I think that's certainly going to be a necessity. Pandemic responsiveness is going to be front of mind, obviously. We've now crossed the hurdle of, I think, demonstrating that RNA vaccines can be effective. This modality being potentially one of the most responsive, potentially, for new pandemic development. But then to the trend you described generally, which is how do we assess drugs more rapidly in order to benefit patients? Now, there's a very tight rope to walk there as we look at some of the recent approvals that have come under scrutiny. But I think there are other dimensions to this as well. It comes down to manufacturing capacity, as I was suggesting before, as a challenge, making sure that different territories are equipped to address the challenges of their region in a dynamic way, because as we know now, pandemics like this are a global challenge, not just a domestic one. So long as this virus continues community spread in other parts of the world, we're at risk of escape variants. So we need to have that mindset, not only for us in the US, but elsewhere. And then the other thing is, I think there are a lot of perhaps somewhat antiquated laws on even our books here in the US, but elsewhere, that don't appreciate the maturation of technologies in our sector in a way that facilitates collaboration. Without going into detail, I will say we've run into some roadblocks, particularly in our internationally driven collaborations that have slowed us down a little bit. And I'm not often one for deregulation, but this might be one example.
Yeah. And what concerns you?
I think some of it is the speed of responsiveness, but I think the liquidity question is a concern for me as well. With all this frothiness in the market, I'm concerned that we are going to see an emphasis on that, and that there may be some backlash, if you will, there's always cycles to these times, but I'm hoping that this cycle, whether it's financial or general awareness, because if you'll harken back to SARS or the swine flu H1 or Ebola outbreaks or Zika outbreaks, it seems to me every year or two thereafter, they'll have this acute awareness for, oh yes, we really need to be prepared. And then a year, 3 or 4 years later, everyone's forgotten, funding's dried up for these types of technologies and programs. And then here we find ourselves in 2020 grappling with our responsiveness. So I hope that we don't fall into the trap, or I actually, to respond to your question directly, I am somewhat concerned that we may fall into the trap again of forgetting just what's happened this last year and a half or so, and losing our vigilance.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a real risk, right? For years, people have been saying, warning, this could happen, warning, this could happen. And lo and behold, it came and it happened. I certainly didn't know the vast impact that we were going to see in the marketplace from this overall. Initially, the way it was being described, I just thought this could be a severe cold, but then you watch the news and the emergency rooms getting shut down or packed with people. I was just something that I could never fathom based on what I'd seen and things like that. And I think there are epidemiologists and other people that were warning that, hey, look, this can happen. And certainly we can quickly forget. So I agree with you. Hopefully that doesn't happen. What excites you?
I think the future. Here at HDT, we have these RNA technologies that are a part of a modality that is just coming of age. And you look back 30, 40 years ago, when the same thing was happening with monoclonal antibodies and protein therapeutics, we are just skimming the surface of what these molecules are capable of. And at HDT and collectively as an industry, I think we're going to see a lot of incredible new vaccines and treatments arise as a result of the validation that's been brought about by the pandemic and our response to it. And so that's a really exciting thing to be participating in it and right at the front edge of that crest.
Christopher Pirie, thank you so much for your time today. I greatly appreciate it. I greatly appreciate you being on the podcast, and thank you for spending time with me.
My pleasure, Don. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it. And last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.